12:31. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the official first meeting of the Healthcare Industry Consortia. We kicked off about a month and a half ago. I think that was my fourth day. I can now say I have been on board for maybe a month and 4 days now. But it's so wonderful to be in this space with all of you. I just want to do some housekeeping before I hand it to the executive team. The bathroom director is here if you haven't picked it up yet. And Laura, who is our PR person, may be coming around and taking pictures throughout the day. So just FYI, she has an iPhone here, so that's probably why. Again, welcome into this space. Maybe I'll hand it to Dr. Bennings to kick us off from the executive team.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm glad to be a partner in this space, but also want to welcome you to Sylvania campus of community college, one of our 4 campuses across the district. And so I am the 8th president for the Zoom. Okay, I'll have to turn it back. I'm the 8th president, and anyway, so I will welcome you to Start Performing Arts Center. I'm excited to be not only a part of the leadership team, but a part of the dialogue. What excites me most is the fact that higher education in this space is so critical at center, not only education, but training and development and workforce. And it just brings every one of us together in our spheres, not only influence, but our work realms and our sectors to make an impact that I'm hoping and hopeful and looking forward to across the state, but also hoping to make international example in terms of how work and transformation can happen when we come together for a common purpose. So I'm excited and I'm going to have to my peers.
Maria Mangala, with the Government Relations Council. I'm also chair of the Athletic Committee with the Governance Council. Today I want to ensure that everybody participates. I want to ensure people are comfortable to share. We want to learn from each other. And please be mindful of thinking about the box. Be innovative. I think for healthcare systems to really change and become better, we need to do all the framework that helps be different. And so don't be afraid to share your thoughts, your opinions, be who you are. The space, hopefully, is safe for you guys to share. That's what we want. This consortium is good for you. Your input is really, really important. So please, come on, enjoy and have fun. Thank you.
Thanks, and I want to say Melissa Unger has joined our executive team. She's going to introduce herself now. We're so thrilled to have Melissa as part of our executive team. And I just wanted to share, Janet Campbell is unable to be here. She has a family emergency and she sends her regrets, but she's also part of our executive team. Melissa.
Thanks. I'm Melissa Unger. I'm the executive director at SBA Local 503. Last year, really representing both of our SBA locals. We represent about 75,000 workers in Oregon and about 40,000 of them are healthcare workers, whether it's nursing workers or hospital workers or home care workers. And so excited about this opportunity to really bring some of the issues that they're facing in the workforce to this table. I'm excited for all of this discussion. As I think last meeting and been able to be involved in the workforce and really trying to think about how do we think about this bigger than ourselves. Like we're all bringing our own perspectives, I think, and how do we think about this as like what is we're going to need to do to like really lift up all the different areas. What are the biggest forces in the moment? Assessing that in a long-term plan that allows us to think about where we can grow over time. But I think, I think we have challenges ahead of us. I guess we're also excited about the opportunities to really think about how this group can really make a big difference for organizations for healthcare workforce planning that helps the industry, helps workers, clearly helps communities rely on quality healthcare systems. So excited about that.
Great, thanks, Melissa. So now I'm going to hand it, get the microphone and hand it over to Turner Bell, who's our facilitator, one of our co-facilitators today, to do a quick round of introductions and go over the objectives for the day and walk you through just at a high level our agenda.
Thank you, Sarah. Is there a slide? Go. So, meeting objectives for today. Just so you know where we're trying to head is to ground all of you, Consortium members, in that equity approach and working agreements to develop a shared understanding of the short and medium-term objectives for the consortium. To clarify and confirm short-term working group structure, so how we're going to get the work done for the next 3 to 6 months. Tasks, needs, and a decision-making approach to try to help you all work together. And finally, to provide guidance for this short-term working group or working groups and a roadmap going forward. So that's kind of the big picture, and I won't read off the agenda in great detail, but we're going to spend some time talking to you, sharing information, and then having you all talk amongst yourselves and kind of develop some additional ideas carry forward. So we've got a couple opportunities for small working groups to work together. And we'll take advantage of that during the course of the day. That's really all I need to say about the agenda. Any questions on that? All right, then I'm going to just pass the microphone
Should be
around.
coming from the camera,
Start here. And you just introduce yourself and who you represent.
Sure. Okay, good afternoon, my name is Melanie Wilson, and I'm a regional development officer representing Business Oregon. I cover the North Coast and Columbia County, and workforce or Business Oregon is focused on the economic recovery plan that was developed post-COVID, and we've been assigned to the 3 industry consortia, so I'm representing Business Oregon on this group, so thank you.
Good afternoon, my name is Brittany Drexler, Vice President of Care Relations for the Board of Association. I'm here on behalf of Roman Goodman, who is actually on the air right now, or we've been here in some form or fashion. And the Board of Association is the membership association for physicians and physician assistants and students in the state of Oregon. So thank you for having me.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mia Vargas-Corona. I'm the Executive Director of the Legal Spurgeon Committee. We are a culture-specific nonprofit serving Latinx immigrants and families in Yavapai County. We offer a variety of community wellness and health programming. And I also serve on the Governor's Racial Justice Council with Marin. I'm on
This one? Yes. Menu. Oh, unmuted, that's why. I just, no, you want that, now you're getting audio.
This is a trade association representing.
There you go. Right, that's what you want. Oh, that's weird. Yeah, it was using the microphone. For some reason, no one else to fix it. I'm not gonna patch your picture and leave it here. I think it's just hanging on the camera.
Hello, I'm Sarah Cohen, I'm Senior Finance, and I'm the workforce development program manager at Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel. Senior Art. I'm helping you to learn the science and Hi there. My name is Tracy and I'm raised in the from Manhattan. I'm the community and social health director. And I recommend keeping our class that on the enterprise by the law operations team for our community network. I'm here really representing our supervisor organization and our business needs as well. I'm thinking about workforce and pathway for income and employment and better health and consumer when people are fully employed. And of course, our community perspective and hello everyone, my name is Laura Lee. I'm the Streamer from us. I am attending on behalf of Sarah Walker, who is the executive director of the Oregon Coalition of Local Health Officials, or he represents the third and local public health authorities here in Oregon. Hello, I'm Tracy Lee, and I'm with the Oregon Office of Rural Health. I'm the program manager of recruitment and retention. I'm here attending for my director, Robert Union. Yes, I'm based out of Oregon, and my focus is helping all of our rural and
have big groups like this, we recognize that everybody here is passionate. We all believe in equity. We all know what that means for what we do. But what we want to be able to do, though, because there's overarching goals through legislation in this process, we want to be able to stay connected and grounded to that and have working definitions for all of us to be grounded and anchored in as we move forward in targeted ways while still reaching what we're trying to accomplish. So that said, I think we can go into next slide. So for the HEC, we have our equity stance, and how we define it in all the work that we do is that post-secondary education equity will be achieved once community or characteristic, including but not limited to racial, ethnic identity, socioeconomic background, disability status, gender, parental status, veteran status, sexual orientation, and geographic origin or location no longer predict inequitable access to and success in post-secondary education and training. So we do this with intention, really thinking through root historical causes of systemic racism and inequities, not just their manifestations. So it includes that intentional examination and elimination of policies, practice, and attitudes that perpetuate that. Next slide, please. So for the HEC, it's important to note that the state of Oregon has an equity lens. There's an actual document that was created and adopted back in 2011, and a lot of folks don't know that. And so I'm looking at Janelle because we were all at the beginning of all of that. And so back in the day, there was the Oregon Education Investment Board, and this group, similar to this group here, came together to recognize and speak out loud to the fact that Oregon had racial equity gaps in educational outcomes. And so from that came this document with 8 working considerations and working definitions on how state agency or in education we're supposed to be considering the different impacts and the different influences around policymaking in the work that we get to do and in the investments that come our way. So for the HEC, they had that same equity lens, but I was given permission when I came on board to update it so that it better aligned for post-secondary education and training. So we use the lens to help make intentional policies and investments and systemic change to achieve equitable education outcomes. We use it to identify and address the barriers and really think through how to mitigate those things. And then of course, emphasize the focus on historically underserved students and adult workers with a particular focus on racial equity. So the intentionality is there. We can get you copies if you haven't seen the new version, but it is aligned now to the governor's office equity action plan that all state agencies have to look at and align to. And then of course, to our HEC goals and our strategic plan. Next slide, please. So we also have our strategic roadmap, which focuses on, and this was created through focus groups from all over the state representation. And so we have goals around transforming and innovating to serve students and learners best, centering higher ed and workforce training capacity on current and future state needs, ensuring post-secondary learners can also afford to meet their basic needs. We want to be able to create and support a continuum of pathways from education and training to career, increase public investment to meet Oregon's post-secondary goals. Next slide. So a new consideration of our collective work. Sarah mentioned the concept around targeted universalism. If you're familiar with this new work, it comes out of California, John C. Powell's work on kind of bringing equity work, not kind of, but trying to bring that equity work to that next level of understanding. So we're prioritizing better as practitioners to use the term and use the approach so that we can break through those binary of universal responses versus targeted approaches that tend to miss the mark in the work. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about rules and processes and policy development, a lot of the time, we all know this, some of the work complete straight up universal approaches to things. So what that ends up doing is signaling the desire for a diverse and equitable society, but can strike people, especially people who have been oppressed for generations, as being too grand and ambitious without any direct way of helping those. So it's a very generalized approach for a solution.
that a lot of the time doesn't reach the folks we're actually trying to serve and process. But then the flip side to that is that we can get so targeted and get so specific in the work that they often seek to meet the needs of a particular group, but then so can be viewed from a zero-sum perspective, causing hostility and resentment. Next slide, please. So what we strive to do is just go through this alternative framework in an effort to design policies and implement to achieve the overarching policy goals. So in this particular case, targeted universalism is always sensitive to structural and cultural dynamics in ways that often elude both targeted and universal strategies. So what does that mean? So we have Future Ready Oregon, right? And there's this big legislation that came through, and there's investments in process, and there's goals that we have to reach within that legislation. But we also know that there's specific needs in different communities in Oregon that need to have access to those pathways to that. So we have to be really intentional about how we reach those communities while at the same time reaching the goals of the legislation. Does that make sense? Okay, I see a lot of nods. Okay, next slide. So the other piece to consider and how the HEC has been approaching this is a term that came out of K-12, but what it captures is the need for the qualitative stories, the narratives of the people that we're serving to amplify the data that we're looking at. So often that we focus so much on the numbers, we miss still what is actually happening and playing out in our system. So the amazing authors of this book is reaching into what they refer to as indigenous epistemology or indigenous teachings or ways of knowing, ways of doing, which incorporate culturally responsive practices and the inclusion of storytelling and narrative to enhance the numbers in the work that we do. So we have, that's a great book if you want to see it. So it's called Street Data. Next slide. So the goal then, of course, is to move from status quo to transformational. And I heard it earlier today, and it's happening in so many different settings where we're really trying to do things differently. So we know, though, what we're up against in our barriers and systematically is that the system that as it stands still tends to prioritize measurement and incremental improvement over learning and transformation. It tends to be a shallow approach to the incorporation of student, and I would say student voices, adult learners, workers, and community voices. And then it tends to perpetuate tokenism and marginalization of the voices and the gifts that our communities do bring to this work. What we're trying to do is take it to the next level and focus on a transformational system. We want to authentically engage the communities that we're serving. We want to value multiple ways of knowing and learning and see that as asset, as the capital that these communities bring. See that cultural wealth, and of course, build relationships and work toward restoration and healing. So part of the process and what I love about the Racial Justice Council or the new Racial Justice Council is that it's bringing so many amazing voices and passion to the work, but it's putting us as state folks on notice to be like, look, we have to jump in and start that process, acknowledge where harm has been done, and then take it to the next level in a co-creative way as we move forward. So one of the ways we do this at the HEC, we have a small but mighty team. I used to be a team of one on the executive team. I have the whole team, but now I actually have a DEI team with 2 more specialists that are helping us now build tools to incorporate in the processes that we do. So this is an extension or a deeper dive of our actual equity lens. It's the equity impact protocol, which all our offices are embedding in different ways and different processes as they engage in their big projects and planning. And so what it does, it lets them slow down just enough to have those considerations at the forefront and planning so that we don't miss the mark, but recognizing too, unintended consequences, some of those things we don't know out the gate, and only time will tell what that could be. But at least we know we can slow it down and try to get it right and consider the things appropriately as we move forward. Next slide. So questions to consider in your process as we engage in working agreements and the need for all of this stuff is to just think about how are we actually authentically centering adult students and workers in this type of process? How are they actually showing up, right? If we know, I keep hearing from our community members that a lot of the time it's always about them, but not with them. And so how are we actually engaging and centering and making sure that what we're doing and the decisions we're making are actually centering them in process? And then what is the role of leadership and workforce partners in supporting the workforce culture, climate, and the equity work? One of the many conversations that I have with Jennifer and her team and with Marine and other folks is part of this work. We're doing all this retention, this recruitment work and pathways work, but what type of conversations are we having to retain the people that we put on those pathways? Because a lot of the time they end up in a situation that they don't feel welcomed or they don't feel a part of the system. And so part of this conversation has to be also how we keep these folks in these amazing new positions and we don't lose them to other sectors or other states. And then finally, of course, what is missing from Oregon's current system? Where are we still missing the mark and having that kind of conversation? So that's it's rhetorical at this point. So, but I'll leave it. I think that's my last slide. Is that my last one? Any questions? That was a lot. Understand the equity lens conversation can be a whole training in and of itself, but I wanted to ground us enough just to have that working definition and process as we move forward and develop the charter and the agreements that you all will be working with. Yes.
And I remember talking back in the real days, for Oregon, our intention to engage people that never been part of the worker system at all. Be part of the worker system. We talk about equity, so hoping that's the goal. Pretty hard to people out of shadows into the worker system. Remember that?
So I'll leave you with this thought, and I love this quote. It literally wasn't somebody that wanted to remain anonymous, but it's just thinking about whenever we allow people's identities to be a barrier, not an asset, we begin to see unnecessary distinctions. So it's important to value people's unique identities as assets to a full fabric of a beautiful mosaic of difference, diversity, belonging, and humanity. So how are we going to stay accountable to that when we know we're going to be tired coming into this? Time is of an essence. We're going to fast forward, and that's literally when we just default. So how are we going to interrupt that? Or who at the table, around the table, is going to be one of those, hey, interrupters, productive interrupters, to say, hey, we're doing it again, or no, we're not, we're going in the wrong direction. That's where this work becomes super important. So any thoughts, wonderings, questions?
And we're going to have time to unpack this in small groups. So, and then have time to come back and ask Rudianne questions.
I'm here
but if there are
after-
any clarifying questions, maybe about some of the concepts that she brought up, now is the time for that before you go into your small groups.
I just have one question. I heard you mention the state educational role, and so I'm kind of new here, but how is the state advancing, or are they shifting? I haven't seen much focus in terms of elevating that in various spaces. So how does that fit in this work? Thank you.
Are you talking about the overarching strategic goals for the post-secondary side, or all things P20?
How does it all come together? I'm just curious.
That's a great question. Janelle's laughing. So it comes together in a lot of different ways, but I will not deny that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in aligning the systems, right? And so with the HEC being the youngest out of all the education agencies, folks are now more comfortable and know that we actually exist and we're a thing. and so which is great, but really bridging the intentionality of collaborating with ODE, for instance, and thinking through together the impacts on how we need to be ready on our side, and what they're doing to be ready on theirs, and then just connect those dots. The HEC goals are separate from ODE. ODE has its own goals, early learning has its own goals, but all in alignment to minimize disparity and create access points for pathways. So I think that's the best answer I can give right now, but I'm happy to share all our documentation so you can see it.
Oh, no, I don't do much reading. Okay, thank you.
Great question.
questions for Vivian, before we move into a section on working agreements, and then we'll have some time to break out the small groups. Great.
Okay. So anytime we pull together a large group like this to try to work together, it's helpful at the outset typically to find some group agreement around a set of working agreements, or ground rules, or operating principles. You have the charter, which outlines kind of big picture what you're going to do, but it's usually helpful to try to agree on kind of how you're going to interact with each other and how you're going to work together. So we took the liberty of putting together a list of principles or ideas that a lot of other groups have used. And there's, if you'll look in your packet, you'll find that there's a sheet that looks like this, and it has this list on it. And I'll just go over it kind of quickly at a high level, but then we'll give you some opportunity to kind of dissect it a little bit in small working groups just around the table here, and see if those are resonating for you. I'll go through them real quick, and if you have questions, we can answer those too. But there's sort of a cluster of thoughts around kind of staying focused and engaged. So staying focused on the consortium purpose and objectives, and they're a little more articulated a little more deeply on that sheet of paper. But to engage in honest and generative discussions, so kind of leaning in and really taking on the hard topics and working through stuff, and then respecting others' times, coming prepared, so coming prepared to meetings, and showing up ready to engage. In the sort of sharing and listening kind of area, be okay to experience some discomfort and assume that when others are talking, they have their best intent, right? It's people are sharing complicated and challenging issues, not to aggravate, but rather to make progress on them. Speak your truth responsibly and acknowledge impact. So that's the kind of the flip side of that, is to, speak what's true for you and be forthcoming with it. Refraining from personal attacks. So it's about, we're trying to keep it about the issues, not about people or individuals, but also being sure to share all the relevant information that will assist the group in reaching its goal. So we really want people to bring all that they have to the table, and share that information with everybody. And then sometimes in conversations, people will share their personal experience. And I mean, these are public meetings, so anybody can be listening, but learn and take away the ideas from those conversations, but we don't share them, the individual stories outside of the room typically, because it's about the idea, it's about the experience. And finally, in sort of the accountability department, it's important to bring up concerns. If things are going in a direction that you're not comfortable with, you need to bring up those concerns in a timely and before we get too far down the road, so that we can address issues as they come up and not have to circle back and go, oh no. So a lot of you are here from organizations representing this. It's an important piece of work, obviously. And in a lot of groups that we work with, it's really important to remind folks to be touching base with your constituencies and making sure, because this group could, get some traction and start, coming up with ideas and directions. And, sometimes we get a little ahead of our colleagues and constituents, and it's important to make sure the communication is going both ways. They're sharing concerns and you're bringing them to the table, as well as you're sharing what's happening at the table and taking it back to those constituencies and checking in with them. Really important. And then if you have concerns about how the process is going, you should feel very empowered and free to come talk to any of the process support people about that. Sarah or myself or the HEC staff that works on this, whatever you're most comfortable with. But if you have process concerns, do bring them up, and or bring them up at the table if you think it's important that we talk about them out in the full forum. So, any questions on any of that, or comments? Like I said, we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about them in your small groups. Okay.
If there aren't any questions, I just wanted to kind of share some general thoughts about this as we move through. It can feel, at least sometimes when I show up into spaces, just, oh, we're having to do some working agreements, but I will share, sometimes it's really helpful when we start, as we spend the rest of the day on our short and medium term objectives, which are pretty, I'll say, lofty, to come to consensus on some funding recommendations and some policy opportunities. And so I think continuing to come back to these working agreements will be helpful when we do start to get into some tougher conversations as a consortium. So with that, I do want to give the group some time to kind of reflect both on Rudy Ann's equity conversation or equity framework and this set of working agreements. Are these the right ones? Would you have anything to add with especially your experience in this space as you all are coming in really energized about making some headway on healthcare workforce issues? So I would say just, I'd say have you cluster in groups of 4 at your tables just for about 20 minutes and really sit with these 2 questions as it relates to the equity lens. And you have Rudy Ann's slides in your packet and these set of working agreements. So 1, how do you see the lens manifesting in your work with the consortium? And 2, what other ideas or edits do you have about these working agreements? Then we'll come back, assign someone at your table. So these are groups of 4, assign someone in your group as kind of the scribe or report out person. And then when we come back, we can open the space for dialogue and sort of agree to some of the working agreements or agree to a set of working agreements and elevate the discussion around equity. So with that, huddle in groups of 4 at your tables, just naturally. And in about 20 minutes, we'll call you back to the room.
And I neglected to mention at the beginning of the meeting that we will also be taking breaks. So, but feel free to grab what you need on the side here. I was also instructed to hold the mic closer, so if it gets too loud, they can turn me down. All right, well, is there one of the groups that wants to go first and sort of, can we put the 2 questions back up? Just so we can see. Thank you. Wait, no, that's a different set of questions. There we go. Perfect. Oh, right here. Wait, we have to share microphone.
So I'm Robin Moody. I'm speaking on behalf of this small group, but we wanted to really make note that student voices are not represented in this room. And so really being intentional about inclusion, or at least, being honest about that fact up front. And then just, acknowledging that historic workforce programs really dating back from their inception have, comforted the comforted, have kind of benefited privileged populations and not served, communities that could use them most. So just, being knowledgeable and centering around that fact and looking at ways to improve that. And the guiding principles, we were fine with that. Just, maybe something about, just take care of yourself and being able to move around if you need to or something like that. It's a lot of butt hours.
Thank you.
Since I'm sitting right next to Robin, so 3 main points. We had a really great discussion. I like breaking into small groups because I get to meet new people too, which is also a really good benefit of that. So I thought the equity lens was great. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very thoughtful. And we had a question, since the work of the HEC is focused on students. This group is representing the healthcare industry broadly. And at the end of that, the goal is patients. And so how do we, or do we, reflect an equity lens translated to patients? Is that our job or not? And if it is, how would we incorporate that perspective? We liked the idea of thinking boldly rather than incrementalism, and so appreciated the focus on bold and creative thinking, and also recognize that we need to make some progress. And so how are we going to be bold but get stuff done? Then I think the last thing we talked a lot about at the end is when you look at a student, how are we tracing that journey from student to employee, and ensuring that when the student is an employee, they are supported from an equity perspective, so that we can do all the great work in training folks, and if we can't retain them, ultimately our work is fruitless. And so what are the incentives and influence that we can use in this group to help employers do a better job of retaining employees? Did we have any suggestions? No, we thought it was good. We talked about it. No, we talked about it. We're like, no, this is good. This is all good. So yeah. And then we talked about other stuff.
All right, thank you. Another group?
So some very similar items. One, we also noticed students are not present here in maybe the way that we would like, and how would we, want to include them, and should have that question on the table. And then I think very similar to what Becky was saying. Oh, by the way, my name's Heather Jeffers, since we're being recorded. What Becky mentioned in her report out was that we were really taking a moment and really appreciating the presentation, because really the conundrum around balancing diversity and equity and moving both things forward at the same time in our system. So how do we remove barriers to equitable flow of students to the workforce, and then supporting the healthcare industry partners in supporting the students in retention and recruitment, and then because then as we build diversity, hopefully we will have more voice to make that process smoother as things progress over time. But we have to do both things at the same time. And so how do we do that? And keeping the big vision, but also getting to work and really kind of figuring out what are those operational barriers that we're putting in front of ourselves or not recognizing that really create an unequitable environment to create the diversity in our healthcare system that we like, both for our workforce and to serve our consumers. So that was kind of, we had a lot of really interesting ideas and conversations about grant making and workforce pipeline and things, but I think that was, any of my members can chip in, but I think that was kind of the core of the question that we had at hand. And really making a process that's smooth, where we're always not being afraid to say, hey, that's not working, let's adjust our sails, and to use a diversity, equity, and belonging framework to adjust the sails.
Any working agreement?
No, I think we felt pretty good about that. We had a good group, we speak up, so. And
Okay. There we go. Melissa?
You guys should add in when I miss things, which I will. But I think we had a great discussion too. Some of the stuff that came up, I think we did talk about how are we going to make sure that we use some of these equity lens when this decision-making time, how do we stop, give ourselves a minute before we make that decision and really ask us some of the questions that I think are being asked, and how do we integrate that into the systems and process that we want to develop here. I think one question that came up in the group was like, how is this being measured or operationalized? Like it feels like a lot of pieces, and how does it actually, like, if we were to operationalize it, what does that look like in our process and in our work? Like, what is the map to do that? I think without just knowing that it exists, how do we actually operationalize it? And I think one of the things that we talked about is just like, how are we really intentionally creating spaces that allow for that? And that means that they have to be safe spaces in order to be able to bring up equity, and that are real spaces, I think came up a bunch. And then we also talked about this idea of who's not at the table. I think we talked a little bit about like, you know, the people who are impacted by healthcare, patients, the workers, and what is the process like if they're not going to be at this table, that's not necessarily feasible to come to 5-hour meetings in their lives. Like what are we going to do that's going to get their input into this process, and how are we going to do that in a way where we're specifically focused on marginalized or underrepresented communities in that data, if we are able to get that data. And then I think the main thing is taking what we talked about on this equity lens into the proposed working agreements. We actually think that in that first paragraph, we should say that one of our working agreements is that we're going to intentionally take an equity-centered approach to this work that's not in the working agreements. So just like really intentionally putting that's going to be the way we're going to do our work feels like one way to center that is. Miss anything?
Okay.
For everyone on Zoom, this is Laura Daly talking from the Oregon Coalition of Local Health Officials. We had a really great discussion talking about the balance and the tension between the urgency that we have here and the energy about getting things done while also trying to center equity. Those two things can be mutually exclusive at times. And so we were really talking about how to try and make sure that we are putting in like quality checks into our process and intentionally building in spots within our structure to have voices of people who are working in the field. I think a really great idea that Carol came up with was having subcommittees or subgroups, not just the 3 that we have, but maybe having folks from those fields and from these industries on those in a way that is feasible, as you mentioned, Melissa, not a 5-hour meeting, but maybe something that is virtual and that they can, you know, have their voice heard there, so that this group is hearing those on the ground stories in a way that's more impactful than I can bring it from, you know, our public health members. Did I miss anything?
One observation is also not to change the framework, but it had a very dominant culture. It has a very dominant culture feel to it. And I put that on the table because if we start from a place of dominant culture, we run the risk of excluding right from the beginning. So we talked about the opening paragraph being around energy and a sense of urgency to get things done. And that's exactly where our conversation started, which is yes, and not at the exclusion, as our equity speaker had said, that is exactly where you end up leaving the voices out, is in your sense of urgency. You end up saying, but we have to get to the finish line. And it turns out we went to the wrong finish line. So just wanted to share that.
Can you make some maybe comments around the framework being urgent, the consortia itself, or maybe I misunderstood the framework being urgent, which framework?
Oh, we were talking about the guidelines and the
Oh, the
agreements. And
guidelines.
so, yes, we can agree that we have a sense of urgency and we have to work with purpose and show up on time and
Got it.
ready and all those
Yeah, yeah.
things, but that's also very dominant culture
Yep.
framework. And so I want to just put that out there that as we're moving through this, that we don't do it, and others have said this, we don't do it at the cost
Yep.
of actually having the quality, like the street data, that is actually going to inform a better outcome. So having the equity speaker today before the agreements were discussed was very good timing.
By design. All right, I think we have one more group. There we go.
I always like to go last because I can just say, well, we talked about all the same things. And so it's really great how we're all saying the same stuff. I think in the first question, I think we talked a lot about too, the need to, we kind of all know where we want to go. But how do we do that in a manner that we're looking at all the different lenses we need to look through, and also being thoughtful to the fact that some of these things will take more time than others. I mean, becoming a healthcare worker, just about any type, that takes time and commitment. So how do we talk about that, that lens from engagement to completion to then their ongoing care and wellness too. So we're doing all this in kind of a urgent time, quick time frame, but this is a long goal and a long road. I think we spent probably more time on the second question than the first question. And we had talked about like, this needs like some energy. It needs like, it feels like I think someone used the word would need some being amped up a little bit. And to really kind of, I think, to really talk about the fact of what we are doing here and what all these really super smart people in this room are thinking about. And we are trying to change something that can be used not only here in Oregon, but across the country and things like that. So maybe really thinking about using words like, what was the word? Futuristic or futurist, being futurist. Like, how can we think about what the community is that we all want to live in, and what that looks like in the future, and how do we put that into words somehow too. So, and then we agreed with everything else everybody else said.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I like to recommend this to get to know each other better as members, either during or after meetings. That's really important. Can somebody tell me why? How will that help our equity work? Everybody knows. Miriam? Exactly. Sharing your background, your experience, because that impacts how you view the work that we're doing or how that work is impacted. And that's important, I feel. We did it in a board before, and I remember with meeting board members, because we all have perceptions, biases, how we see the world, how we do things. But when we talk and we converse and we get to know each other, it helps develop a better relationship, and we know where people are coming from. And I think that'll help the work of equity within our group fundamentally. Thank you.
I just wanted to add something here as well. This is Tracy, Dan, and Grace from Kaiser Permanente. And, you know, looking through the agreements and kind of the charter, I don't really see a vision statement. We all have different opinions, different sectors of this puzzle? And is there a vision towards overall community health? So something rifting from my colleague across the table that she said, you know, students to staff to patient to overall community health. Isn't that what we're driving for? And yes, that is a longer term objective. But I think that that's underlying all this work is how we radically change our current system and structures to an overall vision. So that's just a suggestion.
That's a great one. Thank you. Anyone else? Before we wrap up this session. I just want to say Rowan is getting it all down. All right, with that, I will turn it back over to Sarah for a little tour through this revised charter, which is morphed considerably since the last time you looked at it.
Yeah, well, one, I just wanted to extend gratitude for all of you for just already starting to, I guess, stay accountable to working agreements and not being afraid to elevate tough points and conversation into this space. So just wanted to share that. I love some of the concepts that you've already elevated around vision and where are we really driving towards as a consortium. I love some of the ideas around I wrote that one down because it was gold around how the student to the employer, to the patient, to the community health pathway, and kind of this I think deeper complexity we have as a healthcare industry consortium to think about the population health, and is that our job? So I just wanted to reiterate that is our challenge together, to kind of cast this vision around healthcare workforce, but also think boldly, but also get some things done with an eye around ensuring we're incorporating voices along the way and not jumping to urgency-based thinking too quickly. So with that, I just wanted to share back that was a rich discussion, and I hope we can continue to create more spaces for relationship building with all of you as we move throughout the day, and we will. But at our last meeting, we kicked off and we looked at this giant landscape that we have in front of us around healthcare and healthcare workforce. And I received a lot of feedback, which I was very grateful, from consortium members around, hey, this is awesome. We are super energized about this work, but where are we headed? We have almost 45 people on this consortium. How are we going to organize ourselves around some outcomes in the short term, around some decisions, knowing that this is, if we do this well, we're going to be together as a consortia for the long term, for the next decade. So I took that feedback to heart, and I wanted to share in your folder, there's a kind of a revised charter. And it's really laser focused on, I think, what our short and medium term objectives are. And so I'm going to walk through that, and then we're going to spend some time looking at the decision space both from a funding perspective and a policy perspective, to really understand as a consortia where we are going to be looking at policy and funding recommendations. So I'm going to walk you through at a high level the charter, and then I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues Jennifer and Todd to really walk through those two decision and funding spaces. So we have these workforce ready grants, and we have policy and funding opportunities writ large that we can look at the HEC. But first, I'm just gonna, many of you have seen a version of this, but I love to level set for folks that haven't, especially I convened some working groups in between our kickoff meeting and now, to really walk through some of these short and medium term objectives. So apologies if you're hearing this again, but I again wanted to get everyone on the same page before we really started to dive in on how we're gonna structure ourselves to achieve these objectives in the short and medium term. So just at a high level, the consortium were set up as part of Future Ready Oregon legislation, really to be a mechanism for encouraging innovation and new ways of working together. We have, I think,
Jennifer at the first meeting called it a three-legged stool, but we have a four-legged stool of industry, labor, community, and education partners on our executive team. And you all are representing various components of the workforce system ecosystem here and various occupations within that. So this is really a space for identifying ways industry can innovate, co-invest, and implement workforce and talent development opportunities in alignment with economic mobility and economic strategies. A mechanism for coordinated action and implementation by the public, private, community-based partners around shared issues and opportunities. And then a vehicle for the development and demonstrate a shared commitment to diversity and inclusion through talent development practices and investments. So this is really big and broad purpose of the consortium, but this really was set out and this is really within the legislative intent within Future Ready Oregon. So the structure then, and again, you have the full charter in your packet. So the structure then is we have an executive leadership team that includes labor, industry, community-based organizations, and education. And we have consortia members, and consortia members no more than 45, but legislatively mandated. This includes a mix of community perspectives, workforce and talent development board representatives, labor, industry, et cetera. So there are some legislatively mandated members, then we have 3 working groups. So the working groups that were proposed were at the first meeting and we kicked off were equity and diversity, supply and demand data, and integrating education and training. But also in the charter, there's a little clause that says the consortia can operate agile working groups on an as-needed basis to address emerging issues and topics. And today we're going to talk about that because in the short term, we're really have an opportunity to make some strategic recommendations around workforce ready grant funding. And so I'm going to recommend that we seat a working group related to making recommendations on the workforce ready grant funding, and that these working groups will really feed into that because we have this task at hand. And these 3 working groups as separate, I've gotten feedback aren't going to get us there. And so making a recommendation that we add a working group, a discrete working group related to the funding opportunity is something we're going to spend a lot of time today on. And then we have a backbone staff and Oregon consensus really helping us drive towards our short and medium term goals. So again, membership, these are legislatively mandated partners and total membership not to exceed 45. And this just starts to get really at how big can we get to really get into consensus making, and 45, I think there's about 35 that have agreed. So there's room to add. And I'd say that the 2 sectors that folks after the last meeting kind of came up to me and said, hey, I think we could do a little more outreach was industry specific and community-based organizations. So we haven't added too many, but there is an opportunity to add in that space in particular. So here are timeline and deliverables. I think we're getting into the maybe why people showed up to a 5-hour meeting today. So in the short term, April through December 2023, this is really our opportunity to make recommendations that will inform criteria for future rounds of workforce ready grants. And December 2023 is our short-term timeline. We do have I don't want to bring urgency into this, but we do have an opportunity because these monies need to be spent, and Jennifer will walk you through this. They are ARPA resources and they do need to be obligated by a certain amount of time. So we have this unique opportunity to make recommendations related to funding. We aren't going to be making, and Jennifer will go through this, specific recommendations to specific organizations. And I'll go through that in a second because we have a conflict of interest statement in our charter, but we can do things like make RFAs for certain strategic areas related to healthcare workforce. So this is our short-term opportunity as a consortium. Medium term through December 2025 is to start to look at the policy and funding ecosystem in healthcare workforce, and developing a policy and funding framework to address the healthcare workforce gaps and opportunities. And I'm going to kind of say, I know many of you have studied this topic immensely over the last several years, so we do not want to reinvent the wheel. We're not here to start from scratch, though I do think we can do some vision casting as you all kind of elevated in your small breakout groups. But here's an opportunity to say, hey, we have this vision for healthcare workforce that we have already convened our members or our communities around. What are some specific strategies we might be able to co-create at this table in the policy and funding decision space that we're going to lay out? So here's a medium-term opportunity of this consortium. And then, of course, long-term persistent 2026 and beyond is continue to assess statewide industry-specific workforce needs, skill standards, and career pathways. This is a lot of the language that was in the original consortia that I think is resonant for the long term, and we definitely don't want to lose sight of that. So this is feedback was, what are the timeline and deliverables of our consortia? So here they are, and we are going to spend most of the rest of the day on the first two bullets. Yes. Jennifer is going to share that in the next presentation. I'm only a month on the job, and so I get to say that, but Jennifer is going to start saying, Sarah, I know you can answer that question now. So decision-making and accountability. So the industry consortia are advisory to the Workforce and Talent Development Board and HEC staff. So I think this is, I think as a consortia, we're going to be working this language, because I'd say this is still needing more, I guess, clarity around who are we accountable to, who is accountable to us, really diving into the accountability and what decisions can we make as a consortia. So I'd say that this is in the current charter around general advisory and accountability, but I'd say that there's room for improvement in this section as we move into our work together over the next couple of years. So. And then the conflict of interest statement, I actually think is really important to call out as we start to look at the short-term objectives. So this is called out in the charter as service on the consortia will not in any way prohibit consideration from eligible organizations associated with committee members for award of Future Ready Oregon funding. We wanted to make sure that we could have representation from a cross-section of folks, but we did not want to prohibit the folks that are engaging on this consortia from receiving resources. So that means we will not be making direct recommendations related to specific organizations, but that decisions related to the funds will be made by the HEC staff. So no conflict of interest exists. So because someone told me that we needed to take more breaks and we're sitting in our space for a long time, I'm going to first open the floor for questions, and then everyone can take a 15-minute break before we come back and get really in the weeds from Jennifer around the Workforce Ready Grant funding space, and then Todd at the Workforce and Talent Development Board. But before that, questions, comments on the charter. Emily.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. Okay. Thanks, Sarah. I have a question, comment, kind of just thing that I'm thinking about as you talk about short-term, medium-term, long-term, which I appreciate, and I like objectives. I wonder, like, how are we going to balance kind of our short-term work as leading towards a longer-term strategy? And this kind of gets back to the vision comment, right? About how do we sit down and talk about funding priorities for workforce ready grants, which are intended to shape a long-term future without articulating what a long-term future looks like. I don't have the answer to that, but I'm curious if there has been discussion about it, and if it's something we want to discuss, or if that's a rabbit hole. We have a lot of time. I don't know, 5 hours is a good time.
I love that question. And I think that's our challenge, that we have this I loved the comments around urgency earlier, just like moving out of urgency-based thinking. But we don't have the luxury of time with this funding pot. So what can we do to cast a vision and see and kind of see these investments towards that longer vision? And how do we do that well? I think that's also my challenge to help our consortia along in that space. I hope to do a both and, but I do think that that's our immediate challenge. Duncan is pointing. And then, yeah.
Besides the workforce related grants, what we want to do as a consortium in terms of issues we're going to tackle.
Yes.
And that's part of our major work along, for medium and long term. That's really important in terms of, because I guess overall, what's our purpose here? Besides workforce related grants?
Yeah.
To increase the healthcare workforce and also increase diversity within the healthcare workforce. And I'm sure others, but I think that's important for us to, if you want to wait until after the workforce related grants, or do we start now? I mean, it's a really good question, but anyway.
Yes.
So I really like the framework short, having the different framing. And I think when we hear Jennifer, she's going to brilliantly describe the overall vision of what we're trying to do. And so that'll take care of it. But I mean, truly having in mind that we're trying to build up capacity of community-based organizations, connect those folks into education and training that is actually connected with the needs. That's the big picture vision. And we need new models to get that done. And these grants are supposed to promote new ways of thinking about this. So I think we do have to get something like that in our mind as we think about the grants. But the other thing I would say, I just ask on this conflict issue, it reminded me, I think we should all be on this around this table without our hats on. In other words, to say, yeah, there's the conflict, you can go apply for grants, but when we walk in this room, it should be about how do we build this system? And we should all commit ourselves to that we're not coming representing our institutions, we're representing the clients, if you will, and the system. And then again, we can go off. But I think that's sort of a fairly important attitude that we ought to bring to this table.
That's great. Hey, anyone else? And I neglected to say an easy way to get in line without having to like flag is to just, put your card up like that, and then I'll know. I'll know that it's about to fall on the floor.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the short, medium term. And I think one of the questions is going to be, how do we work towards a short-term goal? We're only meeting quarterly, and also start to build the goals I think the goal for the short term is easier, and then the medium and long term are much more complicated. So how do we do that? And, also just in, I think Duncan, your comment about how do we bring to this room, I think the question for me is like, I don't think we should shed who we are or our experiences or like why we come to this room from the different industries and different groups that we represent. And then the question is, how are we all like bringing that perspective and then thinking about the bigger picture as we try to make decisions? This came up a little bit in our group too. And I think that's going to be Duncan, I just heard you say that this is our vision. And I think the question, we know to bring CBOs in and then give them educate, like I felt like, and I think one of the questions is like, and I think you brought this up, Tracy, earlier, what is that vision piece, I think is going to be important. Like it was interesting that you, I think that's because you were a part of building this. And I think that this group is going to need to like sit in that at some point. And and I think that's going to be really important for the medium and long. I think the short term, we're going to try to come up with some ways to make sure this money is being impacted and like filling in critical holes. And then how are we spending time trying to build that so that once December comes around, we're ready for these medium and long-term goals.
This is all really great. Oh, hey,
sorry. Thank you. I'd like to, I think it's, okay. I'd like to make a comment about the urgency piece. I very much appreciate the concern about balancing urgency with patience and making sure that, not patience, to make sure that we're doing it the right way. But I think we all appreciate that we are in a place of urgency as far as the need to develop the healthcare workforce in Oregon. And we also recognize that the educational trajectory for a healthcare workforce member, depending upon what type of an employee that person is or where they fit in the workplace, there's different timelines, right? Some training is pretty quick, some training is much longer. So I do think it's important for us to attend to the urgency piece. The other thing that when I'm looking at the short, medium, and long-term goals, healthcare is changing radically. And the way we're asked to deliver care today and the metrics we're asked to meet and the communities that we're asked to serve and how we serve them sits one way today in June of 2023. It will not be the same. I mean, already there are plans for how we're changing deliverables depending upon a variety of things. And so as we look at those medium and long-term goals, we really have to recognize that a year from now, we may say, oh, we have to change that long-term goal because it's no longer relevant to the type of workforce we need to deliver and get in place based upon the changing parameters of healthcare along the way. And we're sitting here today with today's mindset. That's going to be a different mindset really quickly and already is changing.
I think the same is for healthcare. The same is for healthcare and the same is for workforce. Workforce is changing, like workforce and how people are working and how workers are choosing to engage is changing more rapidly than our brains can imagine, just like healthcare is. And so I think we have to think about both those things, balance both those things.
I was just totally concur with, oh, no worries, and I think one of the things I love about talking about coming here from maybe equate it to a board perspective, and what I really appreciated what Melissa said was that as a association director, I have a wide variety of stakeholders, and sometimes when you're sitting in that association director seat, a big part of it is you have to think about what benefits all of your members and all of the diversity that you have in your organization. And to use that kind of thinking to bring to the table around what kind of services are really going to promote this ever-changing workforce. And being behavioral health specific, I will tell you that I started as a clinician 25 years ago. We now have a form of team-based care that has matured over 25 years that no longer fits our delivery system constraints, and actually provides, we have a conflict of highly trained, more sophisticated workforce than we've ever had in the history of our behavioral health industry, but we have antiquated systems that constrain their ability to do what they've learned in both their lived experience and in their higher ed. So we have some really interesting marketing to do and infrastructure changes. So I would hope as we're doing this that we really delve into the wisdom of everyone at this table to kind of move forward both the short and the long term. And so we've been doing some interesting things just around marketing, because most people think in behavioral health, if you ask a layperson, they're like, oh, I have to be a master's level clinician or a psychiatrist, and that is not true. And so I think really being out of the box of what is an eligible grant activity that would actually benefit the entire system and the flow through of student to workforce. So I get really excited when people are talking about the parameters of how we show up at the table. That's exciting to me. Thank you.
Other thoughts, and this really was around kind of the charter and the objectives, and I'm hearing the need to keep thinking about, and I think of like adaptive strategy when I think about how do we create a strategy that's adaptive to the constantly changing needs of both workforce system and healthcare, but also getting, helping or seeding the investment for the future ready workforce grants towards that vision. And so needing to create that vision while starting to make some immediate recommendations. But other thoughts on the charter, Becky?
Yeah, I mean, generally, I think the charter is good. I do, again, and I don't mean to be a broken record on this, but I totally understand that Future Ready Oregon was established around training people to take jobs. Like I get that, but there is a crisis occurring in our state around patient care that is directly related to this issue. And it would be, I think it would, I just feel like it's a little remiss if we don't just sort of acknowledge that we are in an environment where training healthcare workers is critical to ensure access to care for patients in our communities. And so to Renee's point, thank you, Renee, for bringing that up. I got an email this morning from a small hospital. Because the public health emergency is ended, they now are not supposed to hold patients more than 96 hours. They can't move patients because there are no beds. And the outcomes for some of those patients that they can't move to a higher level of care is bad in terms of morbidity and sometimes mortality. And so the crisis is human and it's real, and I don't want to lose that. And I totally understand that we cannot focus on responding to a crisis in an urgent way that doesn't take into consideration all of the factors we need to consider. So hear me, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that I think this document needs to reflect that we're in a real crisis situation, and that that there are consequences to people in Oregon, and the work here that we do really matters in terms of people's access to care in the future.
And I totally agree with Becky when I talk about, and a part of it, I think, is that our current practices and research of how to deliver care have been highly underfunded, unintentionalized on the behavioral health side, because not only is it in the hospitals, we know that we are the worst or the bottom 5, depending on the day, at my entire career for 25 years in the state of Oregon for access to substance use disorder, which right now with fentanyl in the market, you will die. And also with SMI, we know that we have people who their quality of life, because there is not adequate access to SMI care from supported housing, outpatient, all the way, particularly through residential services. So yeah, we have a marketing problem. How do we get diverse students and make sure that we pay them a respectful, non-systemic racist wage? And if we're intentionally recruiting people, and how do we get them interested and knowledgeable about these jobs that we need to fill to prevent untimely death in our communities and also improve the quality of life? I totally agree with Becky. It is a crisis. And I think sometimes we forget that it is a real living crisis in our communities.
So I want to test an idea. I mean, I'm listening to Melissa's point, and I think you're right. I think maybe we are mischaracterizing this. There is the Future Ready grants, and we've got to be realistic, because I hear this a lot from Becky and all the healthcare members. We've got a much bigger crisis than Future Ready could possibly address. So the intermediate, I mean, but frankly, I get this, well, Future Ready isn't solving our problem. Well, it wasn't designed to solve the entire healthcare industry's problem. That is a much bigger issue that this group, I think, has to address, and maybe has to address more immediately than we're thinking. That is to say, there are larger funding streams out there that we could be suggesting changing to address those issues. But it's going to be, it's going to be requiring a lot of money. And I think we may want to just say, look, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to respond to what the bill does, basically. And what I think I said was roughly what the bill is suggesting. And, we could change that vision, but I think that's roughly what the thinking was. And it wasn't designed to solve the multiple streams of healthcare talent that we need. And that's a crisis. And maybe we have to do both at once and just start focusing on both at once, and not make it and just say these are 2 paths and there may be recommendations right away on both. So that would be, rather than calling it short-term, intermediate, just say we got to go to work on both of these.
With that, I'm going to have us take a break. and maybe come back in 15 minutes at 2:30.